All right, so let's go ahead and jump into module 4, which is the carbon and nitrogen cycles. And so the first thing I want to point out is that you do need to understand the biogeochemical cycles fairly well. They are a theme that we find throughout the entire APES course. One of the major science practices and part of AP is that we have interconnected content. So they like to take something like the carbon cycle and talk about it again in unit 2, and then talk about it again in unit 4, I think, 4 or 5 for sure. And then we talk about it again in unit 9. And so we talk about the carbon cycle throughout the entire year, essentially. Same thing with the nitrogen cycle. The nitrogen cycle we cover in a lot more detail. Beyond unit 1, we cover it in a lot more detail in unit 5 as well. So make sure that you understand these concepts, especially with the nitrogen cycle. The nitrogen and carbon cycle are the two that are asked, like they have the most questions asked on the test compared to like the phosphorus and the hydrologic cycle. There are also other biogeochemical cycles that we don't talk about, like the sulfur cycle and different cycles. But these are the major ones that we talk about that are important for APES. So we're going to start with this. Biogeochemical cycles make it possible to support life on this planet. Essentially, without the biogeochemical cycles, there would be no life. If we did not have carbon and we did not have nitrogen on the planet, and water and phosphorus and all the other biogeochemical cycles, we couldn't support life. So that's a very important thing you need to know. Now, with the carbon cycle, in its most basic form, we have respiration that occurs, like animals and plants go through respiration. That's how we take the food that we eat, or we take the food that we make if we're a plant, and we break it down to then get energy from that glucose, C6H12O6. You probably remember that from biology freshman year. Then after respiration happens, we need carbon then to be cycled back through to plants. And plants go through what we call photosynthesis to make food. I shouldn't just say plants, I should say any producer goes through what we call photosynthesis. That's the process of taking in CO2 and turning it into C6H12O6. So make sure that you understand photosynthesis and respiration. I don't remember if it's here or a little later in this section, or maybe it's in this first part, but somewhere you need to know the equation for photosynthesis and respiration. So make sure that you know that. All right. And then there are other pieces to the biogeochemical cycles that you need to know. So each of the biogeochemical cycles has a nice picture like this. I would be able, if I were you, I would take Post-its and I would cover up all of these words, and I would make sure that I can explain this entire cycle inside and out to somebody. So pick a friend, pick a parent, pick a sibling, pick someone. You can come into Pathways and explain it to me, but you should be able to look at this with no words and give me a complete explanation of the carbon cycle. Okay, so that's something you should know. Something else that you need to know about the carbon cycle is that when we burn fossil fuels, that leads to too much CO2 being in the atmosphere. When there's too much CO2 in the atmosphere, as well as too many other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, it leads to something that we call global warming, or more accurately, we call climate change, okay? Deforestation is something that increases the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, because when we remove trees that are taking in CO2, we now get rid of them. And a lot of that CO2 that we're putting in the atmosphere from burning fossil fuels isn't coming back out of the atmosphere. And so that's a real problem. Okay. The nitrogen cycle. The nitrogen cycle I'm essentially going to go over in class. We're going to do some sketch notes on the nitrogen cycle, so I'm not going to talk about it very much here. You do need to know all these vocab words that are associated with the nitrogen cycle. So everybody always asks me, do we need to know this stuff? Yes, you definitely need to know this stuff. They will ask you words about this, or they'll ask you questions about this, and they expect you to understand these terms. So nitrogen is the most limiting nutrient for producers by far, compared to any other nutrient that we talk about in APES. All right, there's tons of carbon dioxide, but in the soil, in terrestrial biomes, and even in waterways, nitrogen is by far the most limiting nutrient. The nitrogen cycle is the movement of nitrogen and involves 5 different transformations. So you definitely need to know these. You need to understand what nitrogen fixation is. You need to know what nitrification is, assimilation, mineralization, also called ammonification, and denitrification. All of those words are in the course guide for us teachers, and so that is something you definitely need to know. Again, you should be able to explain this picture. And that's pretty much all of Unit 4 or Module 4 here. There are some questions. This would be really good to go through these, as I say, every single time. And I just saw when I was looking in the back of the book, there doesn't seem to be an answer key for all of these questions. So if you need help with any of these at any time, just let me know. And I will see you all next time for Module 5.